Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started. If we need more seats, because I see we're pretty full up, we do have some stacked in the back that we can unstack for folks as they walk in. Hello, my name is Jennifer May. I'm the Interim Executive Director of Designmatters here at ArtCenter College of Design. We're really thrilled to be hosting this event tonight for Krystina Castella, who's a wonderful faculty here at ArtCenter and has done many awesome Design Matters projects for us, including one this very term. And we're so honored to be helping her launch her book, Designing for Kids, Creating for Playing, Learning, and Growing. It's really wonderful to know we have really one of the foremost thinkers of designing for kids here at ArtCenter, right in Pasadena. So I will let Krystina take over from here because she's very specifically said to give a short introduction. So thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. This is really fun and exciting and great to be able to talk about my book and what this journey has been for me over the past 3 years. I was speaking in Finland and in Denmark and around the world, but I haven't actually spoken here at ArtCenter, so it's nice to share with our community. So the way that this project came about is I've been teaching here for 27 years, but for about 25 of those years, one of the classes that I teach is toy design. And about 3 years ago, I got a faculty grant that was specifically to research what our students need to know about designing for kids. So I started on that journey and really found out like the 10 most important things that designers need to know about designing for kids around child development and children's culture and how the design process is different when you're designing for kids than designing for adults. And then a publisher contacted me. The publisher saw my research and said, "Are you interested in writing a textbook?" And I said, "You know, sure," but it wasn't that easy. I had to write sample chapters, and it went out to 60 different peer reviewers to decide whether it was worth publishing. And then even after the book was written, it went through the same process as well before it was actually published. And this is actually my 13th book that has been published, although this is the first book in this genre. The other books that I've written have been children's books or cookbooks, so this is very different, and it was an incredible journey, which I'll be telling you about. So just looking at this list here, these are all people that I interviewed for the book that are connected to ArtCenter, and it is amazing the brain trust that we have here at ArtCenter through alumni, who you'll get to meet some of those tonight, here around ArtCenter in the ArtCenter community. A couple of the people that have been involved with the book, can you just stand up so that I can acknowledge you? So Mike Mallory is here, who's an expert on animation and superheroes and mysteries, and Valerie, who's going to be on the panel, and Alice, and Patricio, who's here, who has a youth and branding company, and Jed Burke, who's an alum from Media Design Practices. And then we have Mari Nakano, who's here, who works for the Mayor's Office of New York City, and Dan Winger, who works for Lego, and Lauren Kay, who's with Kid Space Children's Museum, who we've done a lot of collaborations with. Is there anyone else here that I missed? Well, they're on the list there, okay? So, I had over 100 interviews for the book, which was really amazing, and about a quarter of those interviews came from direct connections to ArtCenter. It was really great to think about the resources that we have here. So how did I get involved with designing for kids? Some of my earliest jobs were designing for kids. I worked for the Brooklyn Children's Museum. I designed set designs for children's television. I worked on products for kids. I worked on children's books, interactive play spaces. I worked for Walt Disney Imagineering. Not everything that I've designed has been for kids, but about a quarter of my professional work has been in the area of designing for kids. I owned a manufacturing company which made children's furniture along with many other products, and after I sold that company, I was really interested in learning more about child development and children's culture and research, and how I can apply that further to my work. And when I was taking those classes, I realized, like, how did I get this far in designing for kids without knowing all of this really valuable inspiration as a resource? So I started applying the social sciences to my teaching and my thinking about designing for kids. And that's the result of that is my Kidmania class, which really focuses on looking at the social sciences and how do we apply that to the design process. So then I had a big wake-up call when I started teaching Designmatters classes, because Designmatters classes are all about social innovation and impact, and I realized these two areas really mesh together. Designing for kids to be able to have social impact. So I've worked on some really amazing projects and advised students. There's also some projects that are from students in the college that I didn't work on, but we do have a lot of Designmatters projects. If you're interested in designing for kids, it's a good area to get involved with. So how can designers play a positive role in shaping child development and products, environments, and experiences we create? When I started working on the book, I had to decide whether I was going to just focus on play, if I was just going to focus on industrial design, which is my background, or if I was going to focus on all design and everything about kids. And what I decided to do was focus on all design and everything about kids, and the result of that is 500-page textbook. But there are a lot of commonalities that have come across in my classes, because I teach entertainment design students, I teach illustrators, I teach product designers, I teach interaction designers, I teach designers from all different disciplines, but we always have the same topics that come up over and over and over again. You know, what are kids capable of doing? What are they thinking at certain ages and developmental stages? How do we apply research methods that are different when we're working with kids versus working with adults? And then what is childhood like today? It's very different than when we grew up with the access to technology and other things. So this is actually an interesting brand, which is a new startup called Super Heroic, which I really like, because the designer who was originally from Nike, who created this company, he really studied play and how kids play before he went ahead and developed his brand, and looked at advertising and how kids seeing images of themselves reflected through advertising and through brands, how kids move when they play and their foot moves and the materials and the surfaces that they're playing on, how that affects them. So his whole experience in terms of his company has been really thinking through the social sciences and how do you bring that to a brand from a brand perspective. So this is a quote from Mari, who's here, so I can quote her, that she's right here, unless she wants to say it herself. But in my interview with her for the book, one of the things that she's really pointed out is we should leverage what we can as designers to create things that help solve the toughest challenges children face, as well as create things that give children a chance to be children. And this, I think that's very well said, and this here is a great example of that, which is a friend of mine, when she was in college, just got a backpack and went to Nepal and found a school in the middle of nowhere and built a playground with just the raw materials that were around in that area. So she was someone with no experience with the country, really studied what play is like in that culture, and on the spot created a playground for this school. Designers need to know about the process of designing for kids' child development and childhood today. So those are the three main areas of focus that I worked on for the book. And I think the main area of difference of being a child today versus being a child 10 or 20 years ago is the influence of technology. And I've become heavily involved in doing research around children and technology and how that impacts that life, and positive uses of technology versus negative uses of technology, et cetera. So within my classes and within the book, so a lot of the things that you're going to see here might have come out of my classes and they'll be reflected in the book. I work on a lot of self-reflection exercises, because for us to generate empathy, for us to remember what it was like to be a kid, to get into that kid space, we have tea parties, we create user personas with sock puppets, and we go to places like Kid Space and work with kids and play with kids in order to really remember what that's like. And it's a lot of fun. I also have my students participate in children's culture, and I have some exercises that people can do in the textbook. One of the great things about it being a textbook is that it goes through a process, and then it gives you tips on how you can apply these processes to your projects that you're working on, whatever project it is. So I have 25 tips for brainstorming when you're designing for kids as an example. Okay, research with kids is a difficult one because there's a lot of ethical issues around research with kids, and I've been through many different, I've looked at research methods within companies, I've looked at research methods at consulting firms, I've looked at research methods within academia, and they're all over the map in terms of ethics. Some companies just want to get as much information that they can from kids in order to sell things back to them, whether it's good or bad. Some companies are much more ethical in terms of using the research that they generate to create positive things that will affect children's development. And academia tends to have a stricter process in terms of an IRB, which is an internal review board that's going to say, yes, this is an ethical research process for you to be able to follow for kids. So I've developed a lot of research processes within my classes around user testing, around play testing, around doing observations, and all of those research methods are listed in the book, and as well as how do you interview children, how do you conduct focus groups with children at different ages so that you're working in an ethical way. So as part of this journey, I was asked to be a visiting scholar at the University of Maryland last summer, where I was able to share some of my research methods, as well as learn some of their research methods. And this was in the human-computer interaction lab, so it was all around children and technology. So we worked on a project around stranger danger and really worked with these kids to figure out what they knew about people that they were interacting with online. And they had this really interesting method, which I am now integrating into my classes, which is called layered elaboration, which they use pieces of acetate and then move it around the room from adults and children to be able to build on each other's ideas through these clear pieces of acetate. And it was a really, really great project. This is a project from Alice, who's right here, who you'll hear from later on, who every time you get off the freeway and you pass the Sequoia School, she worked on the renovation and expansion of the Sequoia School, and uses a lot of sustainable methods in her process, but also has conducted research with the children at the Sequoia School in order to figure out what they want out of their environment. And I think that's really important as designers to not be we're the designer, let's design for kids, but really understand what they want and understand what they need, and then give them what they need, or encourage them to be the designers themselves of their own world. They do this in play all the time. So I've become heavily involved with a group that's in Finland, centered in Finland, that is working on ethical guidelines around research for kids, and it's sponsored by UNICEF and Save the Children. I was just in Copenhagen last week where we had another meeting, and we have a whole list of 10 different methods to use that are ethical methods in research and the products that we design around technology for kids. So it's really important for us to consider the ethics in the research, but also the ethics in the products and services that we make. One of the biggest issues that I came across when I was studying play around the US, my husband, who's right here, Brian Boyle, who I should have thanked too for the, for the book because he's been living with this for 3 years. I was on sabbatical for 2 terms, and Brian was on sabbatical for 1 term writing a book. And his book is going to be on interaction design, which is out in April. And one of the things that we did while we were traveling around the US for 3 months was study equity across the US around play. And that was really exciting. I interviewed a lot of people around the US for the book around what's happening with play within your communities. And we really got to see the difference between access to technology, access to programs, access to education, and even access to playgrounds, which this is what we saw in most of Middle America, these types of playgrounds that were falling apart. Also within the book, there's, in the whole process section of the book, which is the first part of the book, I talk about design issues. And Richard Keyes, who isn't here yet because he has a class, but he was a great advisor on color and how to talk about color and visual aesthetics and storytelling for kids. And one of my biggest takeaways from Richard was how kids best understand color as it relates to language. So if they can't talk about a color, they don't understand it. Hadrian was a great influence, and so is Dice in terms of sustainable materials and what materials we should be designing and using when we're working for kids. Shri, who teaches ergonomics and user experience, was really helpful in terms of coming up with guidelines around safety in children's products, experimenting with technologies, what technologies are great to use. And then in terms of visual aesthetics and the process around designing spaces and designing graphics where kids at different ages can understand what's happening in the graphic. Like, we have mental models of different things visually, and these are designed for a 3-year-old to visually understand what they are. Inclusive design and accessibility is a really big, important part, and Valerie I interviewed for here. This is Valerie's daughter, Rain, who's off in a race, right? She was in a competition here. She's become a really big advocate for people of all ages and inclusivity, which we tend to look at that as an afterthought. And as a designer, she has a really great sense of how to think about products, technology, environments in order to make them more inclusive for all people. This is a project from Shirley, who graduated a couple of years ago, who's now working for the IRC, which is an occupational therapy tool interacting with the iPad. I worked with her on her business plan for that, and how do we create something that is both play, that uses technology, but is also helping for her medical journey. Business and branding, we have Saphir over here from Vans, who, say hello, who I interviewed on the great topic of identity and how brands really help to reinforce and nurture identity. And I thought, what better brand can I talk to and interview and speak about than Vans, who's all about pushing, getting into your own groove and being creative. And Vans, in addition to their products, has all of these experiences which connect communities of people around the world in order to reinforce those brand values. And of course, marketing, we're not really supposed to be marketing to kids under 13 years old, although we do. In different ways, but how do we look at marketing to children in a sustainable and ethical way? So there's a section on that as well. Post-distribution is an area that's usually overlooked, and this quote from the executive director of the International Playground Safety Institute, who I interviewed, said, nobody cares about the playground after the ribbon cutting. It's like everyone's all excited, and then it just falls apart, right? The rubber matting wears down, everything falls apart because they don't put the money into maintenance. And it's a lot like that with product design and a lot of other areas of design, is like, how do we integrate into the post-distribution of a product or service that continued relationship with our users in order to keep it going in a positive, nurturing way. So this is a project from a company that was co-founded by a grad ID alum, Niti, it tests children in India for hearing impairments, shortly after birth, so it's newborns. And a really important part of this project for her, even though so much time was spent in the developing of the device and the software, was the free calendar that you get in the birth package when the baby is born. And to be able to track certain milestones in the baby's life, to be able to see if they're on track in terms of their hearing development so that you can catch it if there is a problem. Another part of it is the follow-up services, because if they detect that a child has a hearing impairment, they need to be able to provide the post-distribution follow-up service for those children to be able to grow properly. So in the book, I cover all different developmental stages and how children are developing from a cognitive perspective, a physical perspective, and a social and emotional perspective. So if you're ever around little kids, everything goes in the mouth because everything is sensory and oral. Then as you get older, they manipulate objects with their hands. And this is from Kids Space Children's Museum, where they have a lot of manipulative tools around. And then as they get older, it's a lot more about social interaction. There's a chapter on physical development, which covers everything from health to fitness to ergonomics. So a couple of projects here. The one off on the top is called Soap Pen, and the goal of this project is to try and get kids to wash their hands to combat disease, and it's currently being distributed here in the US, but the goal is to distribute it in areas of the world where there's diphtheria and other ailments like that. And then the bottom one was created by IDEO.org, which Mariana Prieto, who is an alum from the product design department here, worked on this project, which is called Divine Diva. And one of the insights that they got in the research of that project was it's about teaching reproductive health, and this was in Africa. And one of the insights that they got was that girls were really embarrassed about talking about reproductive health and stuff like that, but they loved getting their nails done. So what they did was they created these nail salons, and while the girls are looking down, they talk about reproductive health. And they've been so successful, they've opened up a few of them throughout Africa. Cognitive development and what's happening in children's brains over time. There's a phrase that's called windows of opportunity, which there's a certain time that our brains are primed to learn specific things. So there's a lot of networks being formed when kids are really young, and then they start to solidify and taper away. During that time, they're building mental models. So mental models is the visual picture that we have of something in our head. And something that's really interesting that I find when I'm teaching design is that children's mental models today are very different than what our mental models are. So for example, if students are designing a camera and they design a camera that you're looking through the lens, like kids don't even know that you look through a lens for a camera. It's like you hold it up because that's what they know a camera is, right? Like what's this looking through the lens, right? So the same thing with a telephone, like what is this object? You know, that's not a telephone. And this is actually from a blog which Anna, who is an alum also from Grad ID, started, which is all about family. The blog is called Babble Babble Do, and it's all creativity projects to promote family engagement with one another. And it's one of the top creativity blogs that's out there. Social and emotional development, and I think that this is one of the biggest areas where designers could really become engaged, because there hasn't been much design around this. There's been a lot of design around physical development, there's been a lot of design around cognitive development, but this is a real new area where we can help kids in terms of their relationships with other children, how do they grow socially, how do they grow emotionally within themselves. The image that says Mad off to the left is a company that was started by another Grad ID alum that I worked with, who it's a children's app company that teaches social and emotional learning for 3-4-year-olds. The middle picture is a local California girl who developed this, a friend of mine's daughter, who developed this app called Sit With Us. So she's 16 years old, and she had over 100,000 downloads on her app, and it's all about getting people together in the lunchroom. So it's like a meetup for eating lunch. And then Marla Frazee, who used to teach here, who writes a lot of children's books. She actually just worked on Hillary Clinton's last children's book, and she's won the Caldecott Medal twice. We had a really great discussion about engaging children through books and social and emotional learning. So there's a couple of interviews with her as well in the book. So play is probably one of the biggest topics that is around kids. So in the book, I go through all the different play patterns and what children are learning through play. One of the things I'm sure Lauren finds a lot is just trying to engage parents and let them understand that no, play is learning. They don't need to be doing worksheets, right? And it's so there's a lot of talk about what kids are learning through different types of play. And then this question always comes up to me, and I still don't have the answer to it. So if anyone does, then you can let me know. But But as a designer, especially as a designer who teaches toy design, I always question, like, why do we need to design for play? Because when you have kids, like, they'll play with sticks, and that's why they'll play with rocks, and that's why there's a stack of rocks on the cover of the book. It's like they play with whatever's around them. So what is our role as designers to design for play? And I mean, some of the things, they play with cardboard boxes, right? They'll play with sand. So one of the things that has come to my thought process is really us focusing our effort on the things that matter the most. And where play matters in terms of design is when play starts to taper off, right? So little kids automatically play with whatever's around them, but as kids reach like 7, 8, 9, and they're more involved in organized sports, or they're more involved in being social with their friends, or they have a lot of homework, they don't have as much time to be able to just engage in that free play. So that's an area. And then also the area that's really growing, I went to the play conference at Clemson University last year, is play across the lifespan. And how do we integrate play into creativity? How do we integrate play into senior centers? How do we integrate play for everyone at all ages, right? And keep that open-ended nature going. Okay, so digital technology is always, the big question. People hate digital or they love digital, and but that's definitely the big topic of the day. So this is a project that I designed in 1989 for the Boston Children's Museum, right? And it was trying to come up with ways for kids to interact with a 2SI computer that couldn't use a keyboard yet, right? So I had computer globes and computer costumes and computer books and all these different artifacts that I created for kids to interact with a computer. But in 1989, kids were glued to the screen, and it's the same today. They're glued to a different screen, but they're glued to a screen, right? But that's changing over the next 10 years as the screens start to disappear. What role is technology going to play in children's lives? And that's for us to really think about. When I interviewed Dr. Stuart Brown from the National Institute of Play at the Play Conference, he said, well, it's not about if technology is good or if it's bad. It's about the state of mind that brings the individual to. So if the state of mind, like addiction to a video game, it brings someone to that state, that would be considered negative. But if the state of mind is to bring them into a positive realm of learning and growing, that's fine. So it's really not about is it good, is it bad? It's like, what does it do to each individual? But you can do that as a parent, right? As a parent, you can decide what's best for your individual child. But then as a designer, when you're designing for masses and masses of people, how do you design that customization within whatever you're designing in order to be able to tailor to different types of individuals? Okay, in the future of play, this is Dan's quote, who's the expert here on technologies. He's been doing research for 10 years on what different types of technologies mean for Lego as a brand. And he sees a lot of different applications of these different technologies, from computer vision and artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how they're connected to the future of play. So if you have questions, you'll have the opportunity to ask him in a few minutes. But a lot of our brainstorms in classes is around, like, how can we use these technologies in a positive way, especially now that they're bringing kids off of the screen into new engaging experiences. Education is very important, and there's a chapter on education. I go through different educational methods, and from Montessori to this is Angie Play, which is out of China, Waldorf, and talk about the influence of those different methods on play, on learning, so that if you are working on an educational project, you can use those as inspiration. Angie Play is the newest, hottest thing on the block. Reggio Emilia was the newest, hottest thing on the block for the past 10 years, and it's very open-ended, play-based preschool. But now Angie Play is kind of moving in as the new best thing. It was created in this lowly populated area of China where there weren't access to a lot of child development books or access to the type of education that we have here. And the woman who created it just kind of watched kids play and developed a whole preschool open-ended program, which involves risk, it involves love, there's a lot of social emotional learning, there's a lot of planning, which usually people would say kids in preschool can't plan for the future, but in this program they do, and they do it very well. So there's a lot of really interesting learnings coming from that. Technology, what role does technology play in education for us to be able to personalize education and go deeper into the topics that we're most interested in? And then this is a great project which is out of New York, which, are you familiar with the Uni Project in New York? Uni Project? Okay, so Uni Project is this nonprofit organization that has like pop-up libraries, pop-up science projects, pop-up art projects, and basically I love it because it's this cart that unfolds into this experience. The benches come out, and then all of these play tools are brought to these neighborhoods where kids don't have access to these things. So it's a really, really great project from a design perspective. It was started by 2 architects. Last year they implemented over 200 of these throughout New York City in low-income areas. So this is from Lauren from the Kids Space Children's Museum, and this is an example of how she creates an educational framework to really figure out what the learning needs to be then in order to be able to design the exhibit around that. And what they look at is what are they learning cognitively, what are they learning physically, and what are they learning social and emotionally, and then how is that integrated into the learning. This is their early childhood center exhibit. Okay, then there's children's spaces. So in the children's spaces chapter, I cover everything from the home to playgrounds to pop-up play, and then children's relationships to nature. And then the last chapter is children's media and technology, and about half of that chapter I focus on new technologies and what the possibilities are for the use of those technologies as a communication tool, as a tool for making, as a tool for consumption, and interactive learning, all different things that you can do with the technology. And this is a great example of the personalization of the technology that we have coming. But I also spend a lot of time talking about media because the content is, people are on the technology because of the content that's being created, right? And as far as entertainment designers, music creators, filmmakers, looking at what is the content that we're creating that's going to help to best nurture children through storytelling. So this slide here is just, so that was the book. This slide here just goes through what I've been working on with this group, with the Designing for Children's Rights organization that's out of Scandinavia. And I was just there last week. Last year we developed these ethical guidelines the guidelines on designing for children, and this year what we did was we educated businesses on how to use those guidelines. So IKEA was there. There were a lot of really large companies throughout Europe that wanted to learn how to integrate these guidelines into their businesses. And this is my group of friends here. And here we are working on an online class together. So there's a teacher there that's from Spain, there's a teacher there from Tel Aviv, there's a teacher from Denmark, there's a teacher from the Netherlands, and then there's a few others that are in that picture. So we're working on a course that can educate students and companies on these guidelines so that they can integrate it into their design process. And then I won't go through all of these, but this kind of gives you an idea about what those guidelines look like. They're based on UNICEF's Children's Rights Initiative, which goes through the rights of the child, which includes the right to education, the right to play, the right to health care, and each one of these relate back to technology, so everyone can use it, relates to their non-discrimination. Give me room to explore and support my growth relates back to their right to development. So I have the website listed in the book. These are all open source. The rights are listed online, and there are different methods of how to apply them as well. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that, as designers, we really need to focus on areas where we can make the most positive change. And if you're thinking about your career and what you want to do, there's a lot of opportunities in terms of having impact when you're designing for children. So one of the things that I learned from Mari in her interview and just in talking to her is it's really important for designers to start to take leadership roles within companies so that we can be the voice in terms of making some of these changes in terms of how these processes are implemented. And we always need to keep that exploratory, experimental nature of play at the forefront. And we always need to consider the positive and negative effects of the decisions that we make and how we can integrate the most benefit for the child. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to invite our guests up. So if you want to come and sit in the front. I have a whole bunch of questions. I'll come down as well.
Okay, my name is Alice Fung. Thank you for inviting me, Krystina. That was a great talk. I actually taught at ArtCenter in the Hillside campus as an adjunct for 13 years, so I'm technically an alum. I practice as an architect, also as an artist, and I have been teaching at Roski School of Art and Design at USC. So I think some of my experience in designing for kids has been with schools. My company worked on the Sequoia School in Pasadena, as well as actually a couple of other schools in Pasadena, Waldorf and Frostig. They're not built yet, so.
There's 2 other microphones there as well.
I'll just share. My name is Lauren Kay. I'm the Chief Officer of Learning Environments at Kidspace Children's Museum. I'm also on the board of directors of the Outdoor Classroom Project, which is an initiative of the Child Education Center that works on bringing outdoor environments to child care centers throughout the country. And I'm here tonight because I love play and kids. And I think this is just really important work that we're going to be talking about, is how do we make sure that what we're doing is appropriate and great for all kids.
Hi, everyone. Any MDP folks in here? Really? Oh, okay, cool. I'm an MDP grad. I was actually graphic design also prior, and I got sucked into MDP by another MDP person. I was not a designer first and foremost. I was actually working in Little Tokyo Service Center, Community Development Corporation, as a youth service coordinator, background in Asian American studies first, and community activist for a long time in LA, and then transitioned into the design world because I really felt that the children I was working with were really asking for creative solutions to the things that they weren't getting in their communities and in their schools, so I made the leap here. I worked for UNICEF for about 4.5 years as the design and interaction lead for UNICEF Innovation, where we focused a lot on looking at future technologies and how those could be effective in the development space, and then moved on to New York City, city's mayor's office for economic opportunity, where I am now the director for the Service Design Studio, which is the first municipal design studio in the nation. So now we practice how we can apply a service design lens into social services, and particularly a lot of the work that we're doing right now is in children's child welfare, as well as spaces where families are affected by social services, whether it's in homelessness or women who have children that are in prison and re-entering New York City. So those are kind of, I've always been hovering in that, but I would say my origins in being with children was being a camp counselor, being a basketball coach, and all those things prior. So it's just always been a part of my life. So and thank you for having us. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Yeah. She came to Father's from New York.
I live in Pasadena, so I drove down. So I'm Valerie Poliakoff-Strusky. I am a grad ID alum and ex-faculty member from I think 2005, I don't remember anymore. I spent a while as a design strategist for companies like HP and Disney Imagineering, and then I moved over into the market research world. So now I work for Kantar, which is the largest market research company. They're the arm of WPP, if you're into ad agencies and all that jazz. So I'm their executive creative director. I run all of North America. And my entry into this world was, I have a 5-year-old, and she was the really cute kid in the wheelchair that you saw. And so I had a kid who ended up being born at 24 weeks and weighed 1 pound, and is a mighty, mighty child, but she has cerebral palsy. And so we've entered into this world where we're in the regular, typical world, and she's a kid just like any other kid, and she's also not a kid like any other kid. And so what does that mean for all these kids that, you know, kids are all unique and different, and how do we start addressing all kids together, and how do we think about products in a way that include all children or that go beyond kind of initial use cases? How can we expand out? Because right now, in general, products that are designed for kids with special needs are extremely expensive. Want to buy a tricycle? It's going to be $6,000. And so, you know, just through the use of something like design, you could make some really small adaptations that could be cool and seem like they're integral into the product that could literally transform the amount of kids who could use it. So I'm really coming at it from a point of view of how can we start addressing everyone.
I'm Dan Winger. I'm a designer at Lego, so I'm a former student of Krystina's and classmate of Valerie's, so through the Grad ID program. And in '08, I started working for Lego. We have a tiny innovation team locally. There's 3 of us currently, and our goal recently has been exploring new technologies and see how they can open up new play opportunities. And I thought I knew kids, and then I had 3 kids of my own, and that's been a game changer. I think I've learned more in the last 5 years than, more in a day than I have the previous 6 years. So, and yeah, I'm constantly surrounded by Lego and kids every day. So.
I mean, to me, people ask me all the time, like, what's the biggest difference? We have a 7-year-old, so what's the biggest difference? Don't want to strangle you. What's the biggest difference? You know, because I taught toy design, and I taught designing for kids for over 20 years before I had one, right? And then people ask, what's the biggest difference now that you have a kid? And I think that it's really looking at each kid for their interests and their personalities, right? Because we could look at the developmental stages, and most kids are going through the same developmental stages about the same time, give it or take a couple of years, et cetera. But personalities, interests give you a huge range of how to approach a design. And if we really think about those other levels, we can actually deepen the experience for lots of different children. Okay, so I'm going to start with my questions. So when I ask the questions, not everyone needs to answer, or we'll be here until 2 in the morning. So I mean, we could get a couple of you to, comment. But tell us a funny story about an experience you have had while designing for kids. Who wants to take that one? We can't be so serious.
I can take if I can twist it a little bit.
Okay.
Rather than funniest, I'd say the most surprising, actually, the most surprising insight I've gathered from kids is actually being a parent. So we test very frequently, and we think we know insights, but there's the day I brought home an Amazon Alexa or an Echo was just the biggest revelation to me. So within 5 minutes, we open up, take it out of the box, start asking it trivia questions. And my daughter, who was 4 at the time, asked if Alexa was part of the family. Just blew my mind and freaked me out all at the same time. And then like throughout the evening, she's asking it questions, getting a little frustrated because, you know, she's a 40-year-old and she doesn't have the clearest speech, so it's not picking up a lot of things. So she then asked me if we can give it to our neighbors. I was like, all right, I'll go with this, see where it goes. Yeah, no problem. In the morning we'll give it away. So we're brushing our teeth, getting ready for bed, and she's in the closet crying. It's like, what's going on? Cedar's like, I don't want to give away Alexa. It's like just this roller coaster of emotions within like a 3-hour window with this piece of technology. I was like,
I know, I read something recently, I saw an article that like some people like Alexa is the first word for children, right? So there was an article from Britain about that, and you know, all these families were saying that Alexa was the first word.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a great example of how technology has influenced our life.
Yeah, and it mirrors the sibling relationship. You know, it's empowering on one end. You know, it's fun to use, but you know, you fight with it as well.
Right.
So.
Anyone else have a story to add? Nope. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. What new materials and technology will change playing, learning, and growing in the coming years, and how?
So Krystina and I spoke about this a bit when she interviewed me for the book, but when I think about technology and think about anything digital, there's zero reason for anything built now to not have the ability to transform in a variety of different ways. So let's say when you're talking about inclusive, right? So if a child's lacking fine motor skills, you know, being able to change how big a touch area is. If a child has something like autism or, you know, was a preemie, the sudden noises, right? Like those quick sudden noises can be very disturbing. Being able to, obviously everybody can change the sound, but you know, how much light is reflecting into something, or there are all these tiny little like nuanced things. Or do you have a child who has ADHD who has a hard time sitting still? Or do you just have a child who has a hard time sitting still? You know, like, can you build play in different ways into that game or into that digital thing so that they can get up and move and come back, right? Like, there's no reason that that couldn't be set up into literally every single app, every single website, whatever you want to call it, name it. So I feel like that for me is where I am very interested in seeing everything digital go, is really allowing for that customization and thinking in terms of sensory, thinking in terms of fine and gross motor skills.
Maury, you have some interesting examples from when you were at UNICEF, so maybe you can tell them about that.
I'm trying to think. Because I wanted to piggyback off that too. Because I feel the same way of like it's inevitable that we're designing in a digital space, but at the end of the day, how you not get them locked down to the screen and use those devices to encourage kids to continue to explore the world that's around them and remain curious is going to be really important. So how you use technology to facilitate to keep kids to be socialized to the universe is going to be really important. And then I think the other thing I had mentioned when you interviewed me was about different new materials. Do you remember what I said?
Soft robotics and
soft robotics.
How you're using technology to empathize, to get people to empathize with people. Like,
yeah.
He said people are kind of tired of seeing pictures of starving children, right? And,
right.
And using like VR for empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, exactly. So it's less about making you feel bad and making you donate money because you feel really bad because you know, a starving kid in Africa needs money and needs a nutrition bar. It's about actually being able to immerse yourself in the spaces that these children have been succumbed to and have been, you know, had no choice to be in, and being able to empathize with them virtually, or being able to understand what their life is like. So it's not just like, I feel bad, take my UNICEF donation, but what can I really do as a person on the other side to interact and engage with those folks and connect with them. So I'm very curious about just remaining connected to other people, and also express the fear of how we may enter, or we are entering a time where a lot of times technology is actually experimenting with how we disconnect with each other. So.
Okay. Do you guys want to add anything, or should I move on? Okay, I'll move on. How do you best include children in your overall research and design process? So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you did at the Sequoia School, and maybe some of the other schools you're working on too as well.
Okay. So Sequoia School has a very interesting philosophy. I think it's a great philosophy that really aligns with my own, the way I like to learn. I guess it comes from emergent learning, where philosophy that basically learning doesn't take place just in the classroom. So their philosophy is place-based, and believing that the local environment is the best place to learn. So beyond the classroom, to the schoolyard, to the neighborhood, and to the community. So there's this kind of telescoping of scale, of connections that's kind of embedded in the education from very early on. So it was a fantastic opportunity for us to work with them, because in a way it's very much like architectural thinking. I mean, I think about Errol Saarinen, who talks about when you design a chair, you think about the room that it's placed in. When you design a room, you connect it to the building and the neighborhood and so forth. So we entered, we connected with a really excellent teacher who's now the director of curriculum for the school, and we decided to work with the third and fourth grade students. These are mixed age students, possibly because they are going to be the first users of the new building, which is the middle school. We really looked at how, tried to find a symmetry between our agenda of research as well as their curriculum agenda. And at that age in California, they're learning about California. They're learning about measurements, I believe. So, so we went in there and we showed them the powers of 10, and we developed a map that is in a metric scale, probably like 1 centimeter to a meter or something like that. And we also subdivided that map into printouts of letter-sized printouts, and the kids in pairs, they went out and started mapping the campus for their observations. A lot of it is visual, but so they brought back and we put it back together. And I guess that's just an example of how how important and wonderful it is to be able to dovetail into something that they're already learning kind of seamlessly. And then we also did other exercises. So this is in the programming stage. And then later on, age appropriateness is definitely very important. So working with a teacher really helps. So later on, we built models, and we begin to engage the older kids as well. Did I cover?
And you said that had a lot to do with them owning the space once they...
Definitely, having your users be invested in the process, in the design process, give them a sense of ownership, and yeah, it was a very lovely experience.
Yeah, I guess, working at a toy company, nobody who works for the company is the core user. So you have to get to know the user. So, and to do so, we test quite frequently, kind of with the lean process. You build, measure, learn. So as frequently as every couple weeks, we have kids in, and we're testing, different prototypes with them, and, oftentimes doing it rough and dirty, just because we have a learning we want to get, and we're focused on, we don't need to see the whole picture, but we need to get a learning from this, specific part of the process. And we'll also run some co-creation sessions where we get them involved in the creative process. But and of course doing in-home testing to know what their daily life is like, what products they have, and to see an app test in sort of a test setting where you're only seeing 15 minutes of gameplay is a lot different than when they take it home and you see how the play expands over the course of a week or a month.
She'll take that one.
We do a lot of observations when we're looking at new experiences, but the other thing that I think is a little different than some of the other experiences mentioned is that we're designing for families as well. So children are not coming into KidSpace by themselves, they're coming with an adult. So anything that we're looking at or what we're trying to do has to also factor that in at the same time, and it doesn't have to lead the design, but it has to be kind of part of the overall picture that we're looking at, because if they're not interested, their children are not going to have an opportunity to come and play there. So it's kind of an interesting thing to balance those two sides of the coin.
Okay, so Valerie kind of started on the answer to this question, but she can continue, and the rest of you can continue. How can designers best create more inclusive designs for children? And do you have some suggestions for integrating equity, diversity, and special needs into the design process?
I can start on this. So I have two main points to this question. One being, ask yourself, what gross assumptions are you making, right? You design a thing, whatever that thing is. So start asking yourselves, simple questions like, do you have to walk to be able to use it? Do you have to be able to use it for a certain amount of time, right? Like, just really start going through kind of these fundamental basic questions of all these things that you as a person take for granted, and really start to pick that apart, and then from there you can move on to say, well, could I address it, right? And I think it's really this idea of scale, of it's really hard to make a thing that works for everybody, right? But how can you kind of create that scope that expands a little bit larger than you had initially made? So that's one thing. Two is, I heard this great quote. I was at a conference last week. Val Vargas is the head of advertising at AT&T, and she has a statement of, change the storyteller, change the story, right? And so if you always have the same types of people, whether it's typical kids, whether it's a certain socioeconomic background, whether it's a certain race, whatever it is, if you always have the same types of kids or their parents that you're looking into or you're trying to find out or you're talking to, then you're not actually capturing the population, right? So I would say, first off, like, do you really have direct ties to the population that you're attempting to serve, right? I understand that you're trying to hit a target in a market, but that market is much more complex and diverse than you actually understand it to be. And I want to give just a couple examples because I think it kind of hits home this idea of how you can expand something out. So one is, Lego's a great one, right? Lego's got two sets of blocks. They got Duplos, those bigger, fatter ones, and the tiny Lego ones. So my kid can't play with the tiny Lego ones because it's too hard to find motor skill. But she loves the Duplos. I mean, that was her 4th birthday party, was a Lego party. So that's one great example of really just making two sets, and you don't have to market it like this is the special needs one, because there's no need, right? Like, it can serve a totally different population and be adapted. And so I think about openness. So the other one I talked to Krystina about is, you guys know Radio Flyer? They made the wagons back in the day and the tricycles. So they still make tricycles, but part of what they do with their tricycles is they have these a few adaptable pieces. So you could get like a plastic band that you can attach and a few other things. And like literally this little plastic thing that goes around the kid in the tricycle is like $15 more, right? But you put it on there and all of a sudden that's the difference between like my kid when she was little being able to sit in a tricycle or not sit in a tricycle because it would keep her from, we call it, she lists like a ship. And so something like that's really amazing. And then we just bought this brand new product. Does anybody here know the Power Wheels? Do you remember those when you were a kid, right? Yeah, like it had two really big wheels and then a small wheel, and you sat really low to the ground. So there's a new one, but it's automatic. It's got a motor in it. And so it's taking storm in the special needs community because it's basically like a version of a motorized wheelchair, but like minus 2 zeros, right? And so it's great, but that's something, so it basically has, and I can't do it while I hold the microphone, but it has two little joysticks, right, in both hands. And it's really cool. You sit in it, you can drive it around, so like my kid can now roll around in the grass, except it has two joysticks. So this is something where to me it's like, oh, you got so far, right? Like you already did this thing that even more kids can use than not. But a lot of special needs families are hacking it because if you have something like cerebral palsy, the ability to push two joysticks with both hands with the same amount of force, good luck, right? Or what if you only have one limb, right? There are all these things that, like, yes, the chance that you have a vast market of people of only one limb is not large unless you're making prosthetics, right? But the idea is, how do you start to think about these things? Could you have that joystick? Could you move it? Could it sit it on one side or not? Could you decide to use two or one? Like, there are all these like questions that you can just slowly start to tap into, which it makes that product that's going to hit a market all of a sudden be much more accessible to many more people.
I'm ready to invest into your company. You're going to start with.
I'll take
with
all your
these
money,
great-
happily.
I also want you to add some of the things that you told me about spaces, because I know that you have a real problem with nature and a lot of spaces.
So my husband and I were big hikers and campers and all that jazz before we had a kid. And we are not now, because nature for us is a really, really difficult place. And I actually just joined our playground task force at my daughter's new school because I heard two words which I despise, which is natural playground. I hate it, right? Like, so many of us like grew up and we're like, oh, but kids need to get back into nature and, you know, free form and run around. Okay, so if you have limited mobility, why don't you try moving in mulch or in sand? You can't, right? And so all of a sudden, something that like has this really great origin story that's coming from this really great place of let's try to create free play that's using natural materials becomes this entire roadblock. And my husband and I hate playgrounds. Like, so there's grass, okay. I mean, she's in a wheelchair, but getting around in something like that is really hard, whether you're in a walker, right? Like all these different environments, if you have sensory issues, a lot of kids running around, like that can just be really hard and intense. And so for me, it's really this idea of like, how do you stop and make these choices? And I was very lucky because I heard that our school was having this playground group, right, this task force, and I just read it on a Facebook post and then was like, wait. And then they said there were natural playground. I said, can we please? No. And I joined the task force right away, and I've already met with a couple builders to do something entirely different. But it's really this idea of just before you make a decision, just stop and go talk to some people that you maybe think would never use your product or people who would use your product. And you might hear some really insightful things, and you can even find them for free on Facebook groups, because there are probably Facebook groups in all these different areas. And again, just really think like, what assumptions are you making? Because something like a natural playground is making an assumption that everyone has the same ability to move in that space. And that's an extreme assumption that you're making.
Yeah, and one of the things that really stuck to me about when you talked about spaces and moving around spaces and stuff, it was really about the independence, right? So we think about it from the physical limitations of moving around spaces, but when Valerie talked about it, it was like, I love going to the science center because it's this huge big room that my daughter could be all the way over there and I could see her and she can do her own thing, right? So the social and emotional part of it is really important.
Yeah, and that's huge, right? Because every parent wants to foster independence in their children, right? Like that's part of the whole thing that children are learning and growing with. And so we go to museums a lot, and my daughter in a museum, because it's got nice smooth concrete floors, has the ability to wheel up to me and say bye-bye, and then she just wheels away. And we let her, right? I mean, she's probably within eye shot, like we can see her, but she can't do that anywhere else. She can't run off and be independent. And so to Krystina's point, these are essential things in childhood development that your child needs to learn to gain that sense of self, right? To really trust themselves. There are all these things, and if your body or your brain operates slightly atypically than a normal child, or just to Krystina's point, like kids develop at very different rates, even if you're typical, right? And so how do you really create environments that can foster everyone creating that autonomy, creating that independence?
Mary, do you want to add something about social equity?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, from my perspective, when we're designing with kids or for families, you know, first of all, the studio's projects are all anchored in principles of design, service design, which are about designing for equity, which are about lowering the barriers to entry for any product or service that we're touching. And every single project we enter, we create specific design principles for them that guide the process, so we're more sensitive to the end users, the populations that we're working with. But to add to that, for me, it's not, I'm not working directly as you are, but we also recognize as a team and as an office that we need to become more conscious of inclusivity inside the office, or we can't design for inclusivity. And so that means, do we bring in disabled design fellows to be on our team, not only to just be there, but to teach us how to think differently? Is it about us getting trained? Is it about changing the HR and hiring process on our teams so that we can ensure that our own teams are diverse? And that's gonna help us transform from the inside and become more conscious about who we're thinking about at the end of the day. Because we just don't want to just pull in a consultant for 5 seconds and say, help us think about it. Thanks so much, we did our diligence. We need to embed it. So when change a story, change a system. Yeah. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and so we're working on that. But that's also to say then, as a designer, when you get into these positions where, you know, we're talking about being a leader at the table, if you care about these things, which you should, these are the things you need to advocate for and push in the companies that you work for. I don't work with toys and products so much, but I work with people who care about New Yorkers. And so, you know, but we have to know all these nuances, or we can't serve the most underserved and vulnerable populations in the city.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Thank you. What do you think designers should consider related to children's rights in the design process, and what are the barriers to including children's rights? It's a hard one.
I'm really bad with my.
What do you think designers should consider related to children's rights in the design process? So a lot of time, you know, we're thinking top down, you know, we're designing for kids, they're this other over there, right? So what is their right for inclusion in the process, and also in the research process, and in things that you make for them? Valerie's going to go again.
I'll comment if no one else has anything to say. Okay, it's a small comment, which is, it's a very simple thought, but children are humans and people too. And there's a parenting method, the RIE method, and which basically says, you know, from a very young age of your babies, treat them as you would humans. So I actually didn't call my kid a baby, I called her my little human. To really try to help imbue a young human is a whole person, and to respect their ideas and to respect their perspective as part of the process. I mean, obviously, we understand more and where it sits within the system, but I think just in general, really respecting them as their own voice. And if you're going to be designing a thing for them, if you don't have them involved somewhere in the process, then I think you're missing out immensely.
I was gonna say that, you know, in government, you think sometimes it's a novel idea that if you're working for kids or you're designing something for teenagers, that maybe you should talk to them, and it doesn't always happen. And my eyeballs want to pop out when I hear that, but it happens, and people think that or don't think that way. And we have to really push that designing for children means designing with them. But that also means that we have to talk about that their voice is legit, that everything they say is true, like that they have their perspective that should be valued as much as the adults in government think that they're right, and then at the same time, in terms of processes like IRBs, which are the internal review boards, and when you're about to go do design research and you say, I want to talk to kids for this particular child welfare issue with families and children, and they're like, we've never really kind of gone out and researched kids before, so I don't know if we could pass this through. You're like, you have to pass this through. We have to talk to these kids because they're the ones that are going to give us the answer to how to change this service system. And so this is how we're going to do it, and this is why. And you have to make a compelling argument. But once you can get that IRB board to approve it, you've broken through a barrier that you can use again and again and again for the future. So those are kind of ways that we work to enable children's voices to be heard early on in a process when designing something.
Yeah, it's reminding me a lot. My friend Tanya here teaches at a Reggio school, and I have another friend, Rolene, who owns a Reggio Emilia school, which is from Reggio Emilia, Italy, and their philosophy is children are citizens just like we're citizens, and there's a lot of talk about designing for tomorrow. When you're designing for kids, you're thinking about their future, you're designing for the future, right? And they say, forget all of that, children are here today, right now, they have a voice, and they have needs. How do we design to fulfill those needs compared to thinking about what the world is going to be like in 5 or 10 years, right? Or 20 years.
I think also something that when you were talking about Rye really made me think, children, there's a lot of choices that get made for them every single day. They don't get to choose if they have to go to school. There's a lot of things that what they're going to eat for dinner. We make so many choices for them. So, when we're thinking about what we're doing in terms of designing for children, figuring out a way to let them have a voice, whether that's in the process or with the end product, I think is really key, because I think it's easy to forget. Sometimes you just, as a parent, have to get stuff done, but it's, it's challenging and it's very frustrating for your kids because they've got to put up with everyone else decided everything for them all day long.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess
Go ahead.
to the point of giving kids a voice, we just earlier this year, my wife and I started to introducing Scrum at home just to keep our sanity with a 5, 2, and 1-year-old. And in the process, one of our first tasks was to, make evenings calmer. That was our goal for the week. And the unintended consequence of that, just to put it on the board and to, have it visualized, we brought our kids into the process. So they understand, and then they start working with us instead of us just yelling at them to be quiet. And now it's sort of evolved, and now they're setting their own goals for the week. And it's an early experiment, but it's giving them a voice within the family rather than just taking the typical child role.
Right.
I'm going to add a parenting win to that comment, which is my daughter brings a thing to bed with her every night. And sometimes those certain stuffed animals or toys or whatever can distract her from sleep. And so we used to do a thing where we would say, if you can't stop playing with that, then we're going to you're going to lose it because you need to focus on sleep. And you can imagine how that went. And then I just had the bright idea to say, I started talking to the animal or the thing, right? So the other night she had Clifford in bed with her, and I said, all right, look, Clifford, Rain needs to go to sleep, so I need you to really please let her sleep. Rain, can you please help Clifford, calm down when he needs to, right? So I literally I'm getting the same thing, but it's phenomenal because there's no fighting because now it's her choice and she's in charge. And literally the other night she called my husband in and she said, Clifford's not letting me focus, and so can you please take him away? But she owned it, right? And so something like that where I'm getting the same reward, right? My kid is going to go to sleep instead of stay up. But she is now the driver of that control and of that choice, and it makes for an entirely different atmosphere.
Great. Okay, our next question. What are some of the biggest ethical challenges you see in products, environments, and experiences for kids today? And if you know, how would you address them? Biggest challenges in the world of kids today.
I guess there's a lot of concern around digital content. You know, some of it's great for kids, some of it's not so great, and you know, a lot of games, you know, they'll trigger, you know, these dopamine rushes, and they're designed strictly to be addictive. And I think the biggest challenges with like headsets like the HoloLens and Magic Leap 1, they're, you know, what's digital content and what's the real world is going to be, you know, intertwined. It's all going to be one. And so what's the future look like of these digital contents and when everything is digital content? So
You have any solutions? Not
I
yet.
have a good moral compass. I mean, you can it's a fine balance of, you know, what is addictive and what's engaging and what has retention. So it's a tough thing to juggle, but like, and also think about what value this gives to the child. You know, sometimes it's good to sort of tap into, you know, addictive mentalities like gamification if it leads to a beneficial consequence. Like just at home, we started gamifying different activities to get the kids to want to do it. So I think, yeah, so, you know, look at the level of, I guess, you know, engagement and what value it provides to the kids.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
I was thinking a bit about the difference between learning and playing. And I know that at first I thought, well, why design anything that's not to help facilitate the growth of children? But at the same time, I also understand that play can sometimes be an escape or you want to be transported to a different place. So we're really looking for balance between those two things. In playing and pretending, or you know, being in virtual reality or whatever, how do you get back and use that experience to apply it, to connect it to real life? And so I think that that connection is really important. But at the same time, I want to say that, you know, the part of the play part of it is it could be, you know, about daydreaming. You know, I was thinking about designing school spaces and learning places for learning that we don't operate at the same frequency throughout the day, and we need different activities, and we need time. We need time out. We need time to kind of exist in that liminal space where a lot of creativity happens. So I think it's a interesting balance.
Anyone else? Okay, last question. How can designers harness kids' natural ability to wonder, play, and explore to get them engaged in learning, their community, and becoming global citizens?
Well, I feel like there's, you know, 800 different ways to kind of approach this, but I think one of the first fundamental thing I would say is, you know, the difference between play and learning. I mean, when children are playing, they are learning, and I think that like one of the biggest things we can do is just to kind of continue to like talk about how that happens, whether it is daydreaming moment or a moment to escape and pretend play. That is a social, emotional, you know, development where they're learning, I need some time to myself to figure stuff out. So I think, to me, that's really key. And I think the empathy is a huge, you know, it's a real hot topic in museums, all different types right now. And there's exhibits at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh on empathy. And I think, to what you were saying earlier, that I think that's an area that we could really dive into deeply and kind of promote that. And that's how you're going to get to people caring about their community, you know.
I would say, again, I'm going to reiterate the Val Vargas AT&T statement, which is change the storyteller, change the story. So I think the more tools and toys that are developed that really help all children develop that voice, right, to see someone who's like themselves. I mean, I totally agree that in many homes there's a problem of the screen and the engrossment. And then you also have many other homes where children don't have any access, right? And so how do you really understand that, and how do you create situations and environments and approaches for all of those kids, and for those kids, you know, especially at a place like school where you're trying to create a more even playing field because everyone has the same access. But if one kid is accustomed to playing on their own computer at home for 3 hours a day and another one, literally it's their only chance, then how do you find those moments of play while they are trying to learn in the same device that's, you know, maybe different for a kid, you know, it's a different engagement for a kid who's used to playing video games for 2 hours a day, right? And so how do you think about that? And again, just think about the different types of kids and who you could really be engaging and changing the life of in a much better way than maybe just like your typical mid-upper class white American.
Right. Anything else? Anyone else? Mari's grabbing the microphone. This is the last question, so then we'll open it up to the audience.
I think when I was working with kids, putting them together to build something together and to be just listeners is a way. They're naturally optimistic. They naturally believe the world should be better. They naturally believe people should help each other and feed each other and give each other roofs over their heads. And as we get older, we kind of get a lot more closed-minded and pessimistic and all that Armageddon-y stuff. And so we have to tap into that, but we also have to enable them to just have those conversations openly. And so I think that's really important for them. And so that's also really important as we develop products, like how we develop products and ideas and designs that let them come together and have those ways of engaging, but also ways of sharing those opinions to people that, grown-ups that have money and power and everything to help shape better lives for them too. So I think if we can do that, I'm speaking very abstractly, but I think if we can enable more of those moments, that's going to help too.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's open it up for questions. We have questions from the audience. Do you want to come up here maybe? You can talk on the microphone. So good, everyone. I think it's going to be easier.
Right.
Although this does extend.
I'll just stand here, I guess. Thank you guys, by the way, for answering the questions, and thank you for your talk. It was very great. I had a question, more like a comment, kind of a question. So I also just wanted to say that I appreciate you bringing up special needs kids a lot, because I have a brother with autism, and I designed a product a year ago for special needs kids, and that was like the first one I'd really seen at ArtCenter. And I'm sure there have been plenty more, but I'm happy to finally hear the discussion about it and hear it become like a real thing, because it is a real problem how expensive it is for special needs parents. And I've been to therapy sessions. I was with my mom, and I know what she goes through, or I'm like a fraction of it. And so I have a great appreciation for special needs parents and just the community at large. So I just wanted to say thank you for kind of bringing that up. And I had a question for you too. I think you brought up like you're talking about a company for like special needs.
I just said you should start.
You should. I'll be your first designer. I'm there. But that was like my main thing, just like special needs kids. Like, thank you. I think they deserve a voice, and it's not heard as loud as others. So.
Okay, great.
Hello, my name is Ming. My question is this, kind of coming from my fiance, who is a kindergarten teacher. A lot of classrooms are like they can't really keep up with how entertaining or engaging Fortnite is, or all of these other things. And so, as a kindergarten teacher, she's having to try and handle this transition of these kids' lives have all been play, and to an extent, you're talking about how play and learning is integrated, but when it comes time to just sit down and learn, she's having this huge monster of a thing that she's trying to fight and just to get them to learn. So what are we doing to try and help that, combat that, or whatever it may be?
Does she have like 25 desks for 25 kids?
Right now, she's at 19 kids.
But does she have a desk for every kid?
I believe there's shared tables,
I'm gonna
two
tell you what I'm
to
gonna ask you
to a table.
So, and you can probably jump on this first if you want. But I mean, one of the biggest things that I've read just as a parent and a person is around how much lack of movement kids are getting, right? Like, kids need to move their body. It's essential to be able to focus. Even something like vestibular stimulation, which is the part in your inner ear, if you are stimulating that for 15 minutes, you can have 6 to 8 hours, a child can have 6 to 8 hours of residual positive effects of something like that. So that's a very important thing for kids with autism or just anybody, because spinning was fun when you were like 5 years old. So how do you engage movement more? So I feel like a lot of people are talking about creating activities where you're doing these pauses with learning, or you're doing a lot more physical learning where they, for things like school where so when you're learning to read, you cut the syllable, right? So cat is k, a, t, and you touch different parts of your body. So you're really trying to take something and turn it into a kinetic physical learning. And part of why I asked about the desks is that you have a classroom space that is filled with the desks in the space that is really, really difficult for a 5-year-old. That's one thing to be in a second grade or third grade environment, but to try to have different types of seating and spacing in that environment, so you're really doing much more floor-based activities. Kids can get up and move around, because no, 5-year-olds should not be sitting in a desk for 8 hours a day, and as soon as you expect that of them, you are going to have problems. And I'm not a teacher, but that's my POV.
No, I mean, I have a real big parent soapbox on this one. I think it has to go with really like exactly what you're saying. The expectations of a 5-year-old. I don't know if you guys, or how old anyone is, but what I remember from kindergarten was a lot of time out, like in the yard and singing and circle time and all this stuff. And those are things that they do in preschool now, maybe if you're lucky. Kindergarten now, the expectation is that it is more like a first grade classroom with desks and with worksheets and homework packets. And I think, the bigger issue is really how do we sort of change that idea with like the system in schools, and really how understand that like the play and the movement and stuff is really what 5-year-olds need to be doing. And if you're trying to make them do their worksheets, it's going to be a lot harder for any teacher. This is not.
Yeah, right.
But even taking every like lesson plan and figuring out every day, or a few times a day, how can you make it physical? So if you're talking about the solar system, how do you have the kids line up, right? Like 5 of them are the sun, someone is Mars, right? So, right, like these things where you really have to take the lessons and turn them into kinetic movement, even if you're sitting still, right? Maybe this is the sun, and then maybe you have Mercury, and maybe this is Pluto. That's a dwarf planet, right? And so I would say, how can she try and transform her lesson plans if she is stuck with tables and she cannot move them, or can she push them aside for 20 minutes of the day and have the kids move them back? I don't know.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your classrooms that you've designed?
Yeah. I wanted to ask, does she have a helper, an aide? It just seems the classes are so big. Yeah. I'd say move. I hate desks in rows. At Sequoia, it's an open classroom system, so we chose furniture that can be arranged in different configurations, curves, circles, whatever the energy needed to be and the focus needed to be. And a lot of times they work on the floor. I think that haptic learning is really underrated and underused, and it's so important to the physical is so much connected to our minds. When we were teaching that class together, we were working with our hands. And I started taking walks these days, and that's the time when I realized, oh my God, I can figure out my whole day just by walking. It's so different than sitting at my desk. Get the kids to get up and move around. At the Waldorf school, when I embedded myself in the classroom one time, I think these are second grade or third grade kids. The first thing that we did was that we tossed a ball, from one person to another the whole first 15 minutes of class to kind of get our blood circulating and get our kind of movement going. And I don't know.
That's great.
I think that my kid goes to Waldorf. Don't judge me. I have a 5-year-old who goes to Waldorf, and I love it because there's no desks. But I pay a lot of money, and I don't make a lot of money. But I'm willing to do that because I really care about. I'll put my money into that, and Yes.
My kid goes to a charter here, and I don't pay anything, and they have no desks, and she's in kindergarten.
I'm gonna move. I'm moving next week. So, but the thing, to me, I see this underlying systems issue, right? I do, and I think it's like these private institutions or these more privileged spaces can enable that because they know those things work. But then what? Can we change the system? Today, no, it's a huge issue, but we know we have to do it. But can the private institutions who have this knowledge be able to support and help teach those teachers how to hack the system that they're stuck in for the moment and maybe enable that kind of collaboration? And that could be a first step, a first way to kind of change the things we're stuck with for a little bit. And maybe that will start to lead to policy changes and other ways of looking at education right now. When I look at the public school system in New York City, they look like prisons, and they're super constraining, and they're super stressful, and can be super traumatic. And those things need to change, but there's a whole bunch of people involved in how that happens. But I think that and this is the same with private sector design. We need to utilize their money and efforts and knowledge and the talents that are in there to put into places like the city or into the public spaces, and give that time to change our environments, or we're going to just continue to create this gap between and create larger poverty gaps. So,
do we have more questions?
Thank you. Because Valerie mentioned that kids need to move. Like, you can't stop them to move, actually, and systems are actually resisting them to move. But my question is, like adults don't like to move. Sometimes we need to design every way to let adults to move. I just want to ask, is there a way that you can use like the thing that kids need to move to really motivate adults to move? Like, it's like a downside up system.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a hard and interesting question. I think there was a study that just came out that said kids have as much energy as endurance athletes. And so adults don't have that energy level.
Yeah.
But there are some really great products that I think are trying to cue some of that behavior when it comes to things like, the Apple Watch and the buzz for have you stood up this hour, right? Or how can you create the cues that need to form habits to remind you to move, whatever that movement is. Steve Jobs was known for every meeting he held was a walking meeting, or not every, but most of them, right? To you think better, it's healthier for you, you're gonna have clarity, you won't have distraction. So I think depending on what you're talking about, there's a cultural aspect of, say at work, the expectation that everyone needs to be seated at their desk. And so can you address cultures of businesses to change something like that versus, someone who's sitting at home and, just wants a reminder to go for their lunch hour walk or, something.
I think I kind of want to ask, do you think it's possible to design something for kids, but actually to let kids lead their parents to engage?
I mean, I think parents do a lot of things for their kids that they don't want to do sometimes, to be honest with you. So I think
Sometimes or most.
I was trying to be generous here, but but I do think that if it's something that the child, if your kid is really super excited about something, you're gonna try to find that within you to make that happen. If that's something that they can really feel. I know that sounds like a cheesy answer, but I feel like we're all parents, so have you guys, Disneyland with your kids.
Do you have other questions you want to come up?
Hi, my question was about this maybe like utopian or dystopian HoloLens future where like all the digital and physical are totally indistinguishable from each other. Do you think that the blending of those two worlds will thicken or dissolve the boundary between play and learning?
That is a great question. All right. Well, I guess one of my favorite apps right now is CodeSpark, or children's app. So it's a startup based here in Pasadena, and it teaches kids to code. And it's got a former Disney game designer on it. It's a fantastic game where it does apply gamification to promote education. And I think, and I also currently reading a book called Actionable Gamification, where this guy, he was playing a lot of MMORPGs and investing a lot of time into it to level up his character. And then he had this epiphany, is like, why don't I apply those same thought processes to my real life and level up me as a human in this real world? So I think that's where, a future of mixed reality can take some of these gamification principles and heighten, with digital content, heighten our experiences to be more engaged in stuff that actually makes us better people.
Anyone else? Okay, you had a question.
So my question is also related to the digital content. So personally, I was born without any digital devices, and my first portable devices was already in middle school, where I already understand like the meaning of digital. But the kids nowadays are born with pretty much all the portable devices, whether it's in home or in school. So my question is, should we introduce the digital world as it is, or should we make almost like a kind of censorship to filter out all the devices when the kid has not yet understand how they work? Thank you.
Just last week there was I guess, does anyone else want to take this? Okay. I like digital stuff. Okay. Just last week there's an NPR story about research done that was actually saying, screen time is actually beneficial, and a lot says, screen time isn't. So I think it just comes down to the content. It's screen, that's just the technology, but what it is, it's access to information on the other side. I think it all comes down to what kind of information they're accessing and how it's designed to benefit the user. And China has been taking steps to that video games will have to build an anti-addiction sort of processes into it, so to curb it at a young age, because at a young age it can create trigger a lot of dopamine bursts, which probably isn't healthy to give them that much feedback for engaging with the device. So just to find make the content beneficial, make sure you're not sort of tricking kids into being on the device or on the content too often.
Just to follow up on that, and maybe it's the same thing, but I think one thing to really think about is how we as like parents or caregivers are using technology for our benefit by giving it to our children. So especially with very young children. So like, you know, monitoring how often they're using it. Are we saying, oh, here, like I have to go do stuff, you know, or I don't want you to, you know, I think that's an interesting thing that we need to think about.
Yeah, I would add, so I somewhat agree with Dan and I disagree. So I think content matters. I think it also depends what age, right? I mean, you're talking about a 3-year-old, or you're talking about a 9-year-old, or you're talking about a 15-year-old, right? They're all technically kids. So my kid loves her tablet, and she likes playing makeup games, and she does nails, and if you know me, you would know that is not an apple from the tree. But in our world, like, so that's not great content. I mean, she also has like spelling content things and, you know, all that stuff too. But she has found and downloaded the Do the Hair of the Panda and, you know, whatever game. But it's creative. But for her also, there's a fine motor skill, right? There's also, she's completely independent. She can, in that world, navigate exactly how she wants. She can leave a game. I mean, that kid goes in and out of more apps than I've ever seen, like within the span of an hour. And she has phenomenal, you know, attention. So it's not like she has an ADHD thing, but she just, because she can, right? So I think content's-ish, but based on the research we looked at, like we didn't let our child look at a screen until she was 2, because pretty much most of the research says it's not even just like, you know, what's happening dopamine-wise, but like literally in real life, if a ball rolls, like a kid's brain at a certain age is understanding like, oh, I can't see it anymore, or is it still there? And if a ball rolls off of a screen, like it doesn't come out of the edge of the TV and into something else. And that's also like a huge part of how your brain is actually understanding like space and reality. And so it is important to understand what ages you're really talking about targeting. I mean, the more older you get, when kids are starting to identify that sense of self, you know, at 10, and really how they relate to other people, the world today, the relationship and the currency is in social media, right? I mean, like, in have you checked into Snapchat every day? And that's something where, you know, there are kids who go on vacation and their parents, you know, say you can't have your phone with you on vacation. And so the kids give their phone to their friend, say, check into my app every day so, like, I don't lose ranking of showing that, like, I've now checked in for, you know, 1,200 days in a row, you know, whatever. So I really think you have to think about age groups. And there's also the reality, too, of, like, there are families where the TV is the babysitter, or you have multiple kids, and not everybody has a stay-at-home parent, right? I mean, like, there's all these different things that I think just add where there's not this perfect, here's the answer, right? Like, it doesn't work that way because there are so many dynamics and ages that factor in.
And I think that it depends on where the question is coming from, because as a parent, we could decide what's best for our kids, right? And maybe what's best for one is not best for the other kids, that, you know, like, they all need something different. But then if we change our lens and say, as a designer, like, what's our role in what we're designing, right? And we have to consider how different parents will use that content or use that technology, right? Whether it's how we decide to use it. And it's actually a lot harder as a designer to really think about for, like, hundreds of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people, like, how will this device or how will this technology be interpreted, right?
I also feel like it's, as a parent, I'm using tech all the time in front of her, right? So it's like, if there's a censorship on her, there's a censorship on me. If I want to look up a recipe on food.com, I'm going to have to start using the Giant Joy of Cooking book, you know, analog sound, flip through and figure out how I figure that out with flowers covering my fingers, you know. And so I'm going to have to sacrifice or censor, or I'm going to get busted too, because I'm going to be the one that gets arrested and fined and pay for all the things, right, that happen. And so I think that that's a big question, because we are in an age where we are we are starting to get addicted to as adults, and we have to admit that, and that, you know, I commend my mom and all that stuff for like not, well, she actually, to throw me in front of the TV as the babysitter and to like find other ways to engage me or throw me back out in the backyard and find me stuck in a pear tree, you know, and like be okay with not having known where I was for 2 hours, you know. But it's like, but like, you know, and so it's, but it's like, it's hard, you know, in this day and age to say like, don't, you know, all that, we're all competing against it. So I think it's really important to like understand some of that dynamic as well. And there was one more thing, but it's slipping my mind, and I don't want to waste my time staring at the mic quietly thinking about it.
I just want to quickly add that, like, with that point, you also have to think about cultural implications, right? So like free play, right? Like, when I was growing up, you walked to your friend's house and you could go play at the park. I mean, there are parents now in many states that are getting arrested because their child is playing at the park down the street with a cell phone, so they could still contact them, right? I mean, those are realities, and so when your world becomes much tighter and smaller because parents can't send their kids out, that changes things. And I'd also add that I definitely think adults have issues. Apparently, I just read another article that said you touch your phone 7,000 times a day on average, as much as your face. Wash your phone. But so there's definitely a problem with that. But to Krystina's point that she made earlier, you know, we have an Amazon Fire, Kindle Fire, yeah, and I think part of the responsibility of the designer is to empower, if it's a kid for toys, to empower the parent or the guardian, whomever, to make the right choice for their child, right? So my Kids Fire, basically I pay for something where I can set the amount of times. Does she have access to videos or not? How much app time does she get every day? When is she allowed to get on the device or not? And that for me was something that was critical because I want to make that call. It's not up to you as a designer to decide what's appropriate for my child. It's for you to empower me to make that decision for her.
I have one more thing. Can I have one more thing? Yeah. Am I allowed? I was thinking about families, a lot of the families we work with, you know, who are in poverty, who can't afford caretakers, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking of a future world where if there was censorship, that the wealthier folks can hire and contract their caretakers not to show screen stuff because they can afford it. But when you have a mom who has 4 kids, you know, and like is trying to cook and clean and pick up after them and take care of their husband and all that blah, 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 and they have a cheap iPad or something that they can do to help keep their kid quiet for a while so they can have some sanity, those are the people that are going to get fined and arrested and can't afford to do that. And we're going to keep them oppressed that way. And so I think we have to think about that. But so, you know, censorship is big, but I think these are some of the factors to consider.
Yeah, I think about the relationship between parents and children. I know that in a certain time period, the children have the tendency to imitate what parents does. So has this imitation become a problem, or how can designers address this scenarios? Like, I think. Or just
relating to technology usage.
I mean, I don't know if some of that is just on the user, you know, like we've kind of been saying. I mean, we don't have a swear jar at our house, but we have a phone jar. You know, like if my daughter catches my husband, you know, on his phone a lot, like he has to put a quarter in the jar. And that for our family works because we have rules about how often they can be on the screens, and they, like you say, have to apply to us as well. So I think some of that's just sort of self-regulation of if you know, how you can do that. I don't know that you could design that totally into the choice. Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one more question after this. Did you have a question?
Kind of along the lines of the last few questions, still with some technology. But as artists, we've always been able to, just even since I was a kid growing up, be very creative and expressive and deal more in the fantasy world. And as designers, you may have to focus more on like a structure or form that is more reality-based. Do you think that there's a responsibility over the next few generations, or even with our generation, that maybe even as artists, for kids, for the sake of kids, and the melding of the worlds between technology and how technology is influencing the real world so much, that as artists and designers, we actually create things that are based on real world and maybe less fantasy in order to have that integration of the two, reality and technology, strengthen that foundation of what's real and what's, so as designers, should we be more focused on that a little bit? Do you think that's helpful or hurtful to kids in, really thinking about that distinction between fantasy and reality? I don't know if that question quite makes sense, but.
I could just, give some facts about child development and the difference between fantasy and reality. Kids don't really understand the difference between what's real and what's not real until they're really about 10 to 12 years old. But, like if you have a typical 7-year-old who, still believes in Santa Claus and still believes that, like, are wizards really real, or are they not real, or are they, is this real or is that not real, right? So it's like if you're thinking about kids in that age, like it isn't really clear to them until they're much older, like what is real versus what isn't real. So I think as designers, we have to consider that in terms of what we're creating, and in situations where we're trying to create that fantasy, right? Or they're trying to create their own fantasy, right? Because they're pretending and they're role modeling and they're storytelling and telling their own stories. I think that it's really important that we understand that what they know about what's real and what's not real, right? Like if the intent is to bring them into this fantasy world, like we shouldn't assume that they know that that's pretend, right? That it's like they might think that that's real. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess along the lines of interaction, I think how we interact with digital content will be more natural to what we do in the real world. Once we start having mixed reality displays, we get into spatial computing now and spatial UI. So the menu system isn't this flat icon. It could be it's this workshop, and right there that's the hammer. So I'm going to reach to that. So in that regards, I think it'll open up the opportunities for more real and more natural interactions with this digital content.
Okay, do we have any more questions? One more? Okay, this will be the last question.
Hello. Your question, a little strange, but regarding risk and disappointment, and whether you feel there are benefits to incorporating aspects of risk and disappointment into toys or anything that's involved with children. This came to mind. Just there's often the criticism of millennials having that there is that. They grow up without disappointment. Everything always has, you get a gold star, you get a pat on the back, and everybody gets a participation trophy. And what your thoughts are on that?
Lori, why don't you start? Because I know we've talked about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think risk is huge. It's really huge for child development. If they don't have a chance to see how far they can go, they don't learn that necessarily. So I think, but I think the reason why there's not a lot of risk is because everything is driven by like liability and insurance, and why you can't put in this unless you have this, and if you're going to do that, that's not okay, and it just becomes a nightmare, and nobody wants to do anything because there's just a lot involved with that. But I think risk taking also happens in different ways, and it doesn't always have to be like I don't know, base jumping off of something. It can be as simple as, I don't know, hopping from one thing to another, or reaching out past where you think you could, or even just like at Kidspace, like we have towers that can be climbed, and how, going maybe the first time you do it one step, and maybe you do it two the next time. I mean, there's different levels of that. But I think risk is definitely something that needs to be a part of every kid's growing up in whatever form that might take. And then
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about this at the playground conference that I went to last year, and you know, so here in the U.S., everything is based on regulation, like Lauren has talked about, right? And I've always been completely against, like, oh, it's too bad. Like in LA, there's like 3 different companies that they're allowed to order playground structures from because they meet the regulation guidelines or something like that. So so now what people are doing is they're planting natural environments, and that Valerie hates, but you know, but the whole wilderness playground movement is coming in because it kind of resumes the liability, and it's a way of bringing, because it's not a built structure that they're building, right? It's a tree, and unless they're not taking care of the tree, then kids could climb on it, stuff. So that's one of the ways that they're trying to resolve that issue. But I always had this, like, I wish that there was more risk in playgrounds. I wish there was more risk in, you know, children's lives and in products and all of that. And then I went to the lecture on playground surfacing materials, which was like not the most exciting lecture in the world. But like they had these amazing, horrible videos of kids falling off of these play structures, right? And it was just like, this is horrifying, you know? Like now I understand like why I'm sitting here for a 2.5-hour lecture on surfacing materials for playgrounds and why they're so over-designed for safety, right? Because when you're watching these videos, you're saying, like, how can we stop this from happening, right? And I mean, it's really challenging to, you know, to kind of balance the, you know, how do you best design for risk? And then as parents, it's like, what do you allow your children to do and what do you allow them not to do, right? So my husband just took our son skiing last weekend and he broke his arm. And so it's like great that they went skiing, but you know, things happen, right? So you know, it's okay because you learn from those experiences, right? And you learn what your boundaries are, and hopefully that enables you to be able to kind of get over it and take more risk in the future, right?
Can I yes and that? So I'd also add the greater cultural implications and parenting parts as well, which is, again, if you're treating your child when they're very young as a whole person, you know, when they are 1.5 trying to climb up something, do you say, wait, be careful? Do you encourage them and trust them that they know, even at 1.5, they know their body and they're exploring it in movement? And so kids raised in an environment of you trust yourself and your body grow up very differently in the ways that they, you know, face risk than someone who's always told be careful. And also, by the way, girls are told be careful at a ridiculously higher rate than boys in those same exact environments of saying, like, you know, go be adventurous. So the language is also something to think about as well, as far as how you yourself as a person, by gender, think about risk, and then how you overcome it. Obviously, in, you know, gamification, there's a lot of conversation around how do you make something that's hard enough that encourages you, but not so hard you won't fall. And I would say this is one area where the special need kids totally have every other kid beat. Because someone like my kid who, we have a phrase in our house, which is, what do you do when you fall down? And the kid says, I get back up, right? And she is someone who just had spinal surgery and, you know, is now walking with a walker sometimes. And so she falls all the time. But as parents, we also don't think she should be in a bubble, right? And there are also parents that have typical kids who want their kids in a bubble and don't want anything happening to them. So there's just also so many complexities of, like, where do you sit in the sphere of, like, hey, they're going to fall and hurt themselves and that's okay? Or are you like, wait, you know? So I think that's all kind of a part of the dialogue, and where, again, kids are so different and unique, parents are so unique, you know, even within one family. And so, again, these, like, universal truths are just so hard unless it's how do you create something that a parent feels okay with individually.
Just one last thing. I just looked up a couple words. The word experiment and experience actually comes from the same root. And I forgot what the actual root is, but it has to do with starting with something that's unknown and through some actions come to an understanding. And so, I think that it's hard, when you experiment, you take risks, and it's hard to, it's impossible to learn if you take away all the surprises.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, you guys. That was fantastic. Okay, so I think Dan wants to make an announcement about a class that he has coming up. Okay.
It's okay. Thank you so much for the amazing panel and questions. If you're interested in designing for kids, next term there's a Designmatters class called Safe Niños. It's traveling to Santiago, Chile, and 2 other cities in Chile, designing for pediatric burn clinic that treats children for free all over Latin America. They transport children and a guardian to their clinic and give up to 20 years of treatment to kids. It's an amazing re-envisioning healing spaces for kids. So, open to all majors, 2 weeks in Chile before the term starts, and then the rest of the term back here. 6 credits and 0 program fee. The partner, Quantichem, is paying for all in-country flights and food and housing. So it's just getting to Chile is students' responsibility. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, take some of these guys. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Hope you enjoyed it.